skyscrapers to reduce that sway. We will learn about two of those systems today. The first, in this building, it's a mouthful, it's called inertial slosh dampers. Let me explain how it works. On the top floor, there are 12 concrete tanks full of 160,000 gallons of water. I'm going to be the building and demonstrate, okay? Let's say the wind hits the building on this side, it's going to sway over here. But as it sways over here, the water in those tanks sloshes in the opposite direction, which brings it over here, and so on, and so forth. And has an equalizing effect, brings it to rest more quickly. Now we can look up and see the reflection of the best looking boat full of passengers on the Chicago River. Thank you for waving at yourselves. It's really sweet when you do that. You're already waving back, right? It's a different kind of selfie. Now, let's be clear, that technology is just buckets of water, right? But it took us a while to figure out how to use it to build one of the most striking buildings you can find anywhere in the country. But this building might bring up a few questions for some of you, like how long does it take or how much does it cost to build one of these giant skyscrapers on a river? Perfect answer to our left. This is the Bank of America building. Finished in 2020, it took about 3 years to construct and it cost roughly $800 million, which is pretty standard for a building that size. Any customers of Bank of America on the boat with us today? You helped pay for this building, so congratulations. Your child is beautiful. Very tall for a 3-year-old. Now they had the same 30-foot setback rule the last building had, but they dealt with it differently. They vaulted the 3rd floor into the air with these tripod legs. Now they have their setback, an overhang to protect that patio from the elements, and they get to utilize all the space above the 3rd floor. Pretty cool. Folks, we are entering Art Deco Alley because of the Art Deco buildings on either side of the river. So I'm about to give you my TED Talk on the evolution of Chicago architecture. And we're going to start that evolution back in 1929 with the gorgeous Art Deco style. The Roaring Twenties gave us the Civic Opera Building, here to the left, second largest opera house in North America. It's designed to look like a throne. That's the seat, armrests on the sides, seat back up on top. To the right, 2 North Riverside Plaza, the first office building in the country built with an open-air plaza, because people realized, well, we like to go outside on our lunch breaks. 1929, Roaring Twenties, that October the stock market crashed, which sent the US into the Great Depression. And that was pretty much the end of the Art Deco style. And then in the 1940s, World War II happened, so we were busy for a while. For almost 30 years, we built almost no new office buildings of any style anywhere in the country. It wasn't until the late 50s and 60s that architecture was reborn with a new style called modernism. And that's when a local architect, a transplant from Germany, named Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, introduced us to his style of modernism that we call black box modernism. These next 2 buildings on the right. Gateway Center 1, 1965, and Gateway Center 2, 1967. These buildings are identical twins. I like to call them the Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen of the river. Just as cute. Now, these buildings are simple, efficient, and affordable, and they might seem boring to us today. I think that's fair. But here's the thing. They had Art Deco of the 20s, nothing for almost 30 years, and then they got this. So this was the future. This was space age. This was luxury. Mies van der Rohe, the guy who designed these buildings, or this style of building, he coined the phrase, less is more. He believed that function was more important than form. The building needs to work. It doesn't need to look nice. But then the 70s came on the scene, and I know some of you are thinking to yourselves, come on, Antonio. Please tell us that the 70s brought us something more interesting than big black boxes. And to that, I say hang on to your seats, because in the 70s, they gave us white boxes. Getting real creative. From 1971, this is Gateway Center 3, and we call this the international style because you can see buildings that look like that in many major cities around the world from the 70s. Similar to the black boxes, they just took a black box, slapped some sand and concrete on the outside to brighten it up. But then the 80s showed up. And some of you on this boat remember how much personality the 80s brought, right? Shoulder pads, perms, glamour shots. Okay, ladies, be honest. This is a truth-telling boat. Who got glamour shots taken in the 80s? Anyone here? Yes, thank you for your honesty. I appreciate it. Was your hair gigantic? Oh, it's huge, right? Because that's what the 80s was about. Everything had to be bigger, better, flashier, brighter, more exciting. And that is when contextualism was born, site-specific design. This is my favorite contextualist building on the river. Up ahead on the right, that building with the curved wall. Gateway Center 4, 1983. 1, the curve of the building matches the curving river. 2, the color of the glass matches the color of the water. And 3, the middle of each window sticks out a little bit, which has the effect of making reflections on this building look like reflections on the surface of water. So that is contextualism. Except this time, the building is in relationship with the river, which I think is pretty cool. And thus concludes our TED Talk on the evolution of Chicago architecture. All right, guys, now that we're familiar with black boxes, how about this one to the left? For many decades, pretty standard until 2014, the owners took a bunch of tours and they were like, no one is talking about our building. So they spent over $800,000 to put themselves on the map by literally putting a giant map on themselves. So that is a map of the Chicago River. That red brick up there, that's the "You Are Here" dot. Yeah, and I just talked about it, so money well spent. All right, this next one is for you Batman fans. This massive limestone building up on the right is the old main post office, finished in 1932, Art Deco, but some of you might recognize it as Gotham City Bank from the beginning of 2008's The Dark Knight. This is the building the Joker and his henchmen robbed. Remember they drove a school bus out of that first floor? That was right here on the Van Buren Street. Now when that movie was filmed, the building was empty. It had been abandoned since the 90s. But in 2016, it was purchased and renovated in what ended up being the single most expensive renovation project in US history. 3 years and $900 million later, it reopened as an office building. Today, it's at 95% capacity. It's almost full, with companies like Walgreens, PepsiCo, Home Chef, Uber, Cisco. Now, this was the largest post office on Earth when it was open. It's the reason why Chicago was the mail order catalog capital of the world. Sears Catalog was based in Chicago because we had the largest post office. It sits on top of train tracks next to a river, and a 6-lane highway cuts through the middle of the building. So it made it very easy to ship out those products from those catalogs. Oh, and kids, if you don't know what a mail order catalog is, consider yourself lucky. No safety shipping. All right, folks, we're now making our way down the south branch of the river. Things are slower and quieter down here. Do not worry. Up ahead, we will make another U-turn so we can come back north and talk about some of these skyscrapers that I know you're waiting for. We're going to get much better views on the way back. But until then, I'm going to answer a very important question. Why? Why do we have this skyline? Why are you on this boat right now? And to answer that question, I have 3 stories for you from our history. And I'll be honest, the first one is kind of a bummer, but it's a very important place to start. The year was 1871. It was October 8th, Sunday night about 9 p.m. The city was just going to sleep. But a half a mile to our right, a fire suddenly broke out in Mrs. Catherine O'Leary's barn. Now, we will talk about how that fire started in a moment, but the 30-mile-per-hour winds over the next few days made it one of the most devastating urban fires in human history. At a few separate moments, those winds created what are called fire cyclones, or fire devils, tornadoes made out of wind, debris, and fire that launched flaming timber across the river, spreading the damage further. To make matters worse, the city thought the river would be a natural fire break, but it was so polluted, there was a layer of waste floating on top, so the river itself caught on fire. This fire raged across the city for over 30 hours, and when the last flames were put out, nearly 18,000 buildings had burnt down. Over 300 Chicagoans lost their lives, 100,000 people were homeless in a day, and a 3.5 square mile chunk of the city was just gone. I think it's pretty easy to see that this is undeniably the most tragic event in our city's history, right? But I tell you what, people still always want to know, how did the fire start? Which is where the classic story comes in. Some of you might have heard this story, so we got to talk about it. Do you remember Mrs. O'Leary? I mentioned it was her barn where the fire started. We know for sure that's where it began, but you got to understand, she was an Irish Catholic immigrant, and for a lot of bad and wrong reasons, there was a lot of animosity towards Irish Catholic immigrants in the city at that time. Chicago was angry for good reason, looking for someone to blame, and Mrs. O'Leary was the obvious target. But they didn't blame her directly, because instead the city chose to blame it on her cow. It was the popular theory for decades after the fire that it was Mrs. O'Leary's cow, Daisy, who kicked over a kerosene lantern in her barn, and that's what started the Great Chicago Fire. Now listen, I'm gonna keep it real with you, okay? I always do. I'm originally from a pretty small town in southern Illinois called Lawrenceville. That's part of what we call cattle country here in the US, so I've known some cows in my day, okay? A few Irish cows even. And I think that the cow was framed. It's pretty clear it was set up. In fact, I would go so far as to say it was a cowspiracy. Oh, brace yourselves, I'm just getting started. In fact, I think it is utterly unjust that the city had a beef with Mrs. O'Leary, who had to hoof it out of town. Now, holy cow, I know there was a lot at stake, but I think it's high time Chicago stopped milking this cheesy story, stopped crying over spilt lanterns, and Thank you. Oh, thank you for those pity claps. I really appreciate it so much. Sometimes I worry that only 2% of you get those jokes. Too much dairy humor? All right, let's skim ahead. Now listen, bad jokes aside, nobody disagrees that that fire was the worst thing that could have happened to the city, right? But you know what we call it today? The best thing that ever happened to Chicago. Because shortly after the fire, a lot of young and up-and-coming architects with big ideas flocked to the city. Because they knew there would be a massive effort to help Chicago rebuild and they could get some credits on their resumes. And that's why, only 14 years after the fire, Chicago became home to the world's first 10-story steel-framed skyscraper. Chicago is the birthplace of the skyscraper, folks. Historians agree. It's because of that fire. Which brings us to our second story. Just 22 short years after the fire had devastated the city, Chicago had rebuilt itself enough to host the highly sought-after 1893 World's Fair. The original site of that fair was in Jackson Park. That's a beautiful park on the south side of Chicago. Still there today, that's where they're building the Obama Presidential Library. And the city hired up-and-coming architect Daniel Burnham to design the campus of the fair. Yes, Daniel Burnham. Interesting choice, given our history of devastating fires, to hire a man with the last name Burnham. But he designed a campus of over 200 temporary buildings built in record time. Massive facades designed in classic European styles. Every inch of the campus was painted white, so that when the electric lights turned on at night, it glowed. And many people had never seen electric lights before, so this was their first time seeing it in action. They called it the White City. If you go online and Google a World's Fair White City, the images are just absolutely stunning. Some incredible paintings came out. And this is the important part. In the 6 months that fair was operating, over 27 million people from over 60 different countries came through the gates, which is not only astonishing for 1893, but it's very important to our story. Because when those people left, they went back home to cities around the world and they told folks back home, guess what? Chicago's back on the map. She's a world-class city once again, which restored our reputation on the world stage. Now, World's Fairs are common events for new inventions or recipes to be introduced, and this one was no exception. So here are some things that showed up at the 1893 World's Fair here in Chicago for the first time. The zipper. Where would we be without the zipper? The electric washing machine. The escalator. Milton Hershey introduced the world to Hershey's chocolate. That's when we got cream of wheat, shredded wheat, Cracker Jack snack mix. Mrs. Bertha Palmer of the Palmer House Hotel wanted to sell slices of her famous chocolate cake to fairgoers, but she knew it'd be tough to eat a piece of cake out of your hand, so she adjusted the recipe and invented the chocolate brownie. In fact, you can get one of Bertha Palmer's original recipe chocolate brownies at the Palmer House Hotel in the Loop today. Go in, ask them for a brownie, let them know Antonio sent you. George Washington Gale Ferris introduced the world to his first Ferris wheel, intended to rival the recently completed Eiffel Tower in Paris. And this is my favorite thing that came out of the fair. I just think this is classic America. A tiny brewery up in Wisconsin named Pabst won a blue ribbon for their beer. Yeah. I think we can all agree they've been coasting on that win ever since. Which brings us to our third and final story. Do you all remember Daniel Burnham, architect of the World's Fair? Well, the city was so happy with the job he did, they were like, listen, dude, we've got to take advantage of the second chance the Great Fire gave us, pave over our old mistakes, and rebuild a second city, even better than the first one. Some of you might have heard that nickname for Chicago, the second city. Well, it's because the first one burned down. So Daniel Burnham drafted what we now call the Burnham Plan of 1909, a very, very important chapter in our story. And this is something you need to understand about this man, Dan, right? He created, when he designed the World's Fair campus, a movement called the City Beautiful Movement. And this movement is very simple. People who follow it believe that beauty itself, and therefore beautiful cities, can inspire or dignify the people that live in them. That it literally will make the people better if they live in a beautiful city. I've lived in Chicago 10 years now, and I gotta say, I've never been this good looking. Or I haven't always been this good looking. No, that's a bad joke. I'm just trying to say, I agree. I think that I feel better when I look at this skyline. It really, really inspires me. So, with this plan, he wanted to turn Chicago into what he called the Paris on the Prairie. He imagined big boulevards, wide views, parks everywhere. And the Burnham Plan is one of the reasons why so much beauty exists in the city to this day. So here are just a few of the things he wrote into that plan. We do have parks everywhere, 614 total. The plan says that every citizen must be within a 10-minute walking distance of a public park. And that is true, no matter where you live in the city. The Riverwalk that I pointed out earlier, that was in the plan. Navy Pier by Art Dock, in the plan. And Museum Campus with Shedd Aquarium, the Field Museum of Natural History, and the Adler Planetarium. That was in the plan. That was our third story. So I hope that now you have a better understanding of why we have this iconic skyline. Why you're all on this boat in 2024 listening to me talk about buildings. The fire destroyed the city. It wiped our slate clean. The fair reanimated Chicago. It brought it back to life, and the plan beautified. And it solidified Chicago as a world-class destination for travelers from all over the world, just like all of you. And that's what you call a full circle moment. All right, should we get back to some buildings? I think probably so. All right, let's talk about it. This curvy concrete building here on the right, this might look a little familiar to you. Do you all remember the curvy concrete corn cob towers of Marina City? This is the sequel, River City, built 20 years later in 1986. Same architect, Bertrand Goldberg. He's doing the same thing here. It is another city within a city. So you can see it's got a marina, because you kind of have somewhere to park your yacht, right? And then it's got the commercial spaces on the lower 2 floors and residences up above. Now it's fun, there's actually a preschool on the first floor of the commercial spaces. So if you live there and you got kids, they can go to school in the building, which is pretty cool. It's really fun. Sometimes we see children on leashes walking on that first patio. You know what I'm talking about? It's not an actual leash, but they hold on to it. It looks like a leash. But this is a really incredible building. Very, very unique. Now, Goldberg, the architect here, he had planned to build 4 more of these structures snaking up and down the south branch of the river. But when he finished this in 1986, the city was like, we're cutting you off, man. It smells bad down there. The south branch. So they never built any more of these structures. But I would like to think that Goldberg is getting his justice today, because the city is going to end up pouring billions of dollars into redeveloping this south branch. We have 77 neighborhoods in the city. They're building the 78. It's going to be the newest neighborhood behind us on the right, built from the ground up. It's going to have everything a neighborhood needs: schools, parks, restaurants, shops, commercial spaces, emergency services, all that. And also up ahead here on the right is the South Bank development. That is a development that's already well underway. They built 2 residential buildings here in this development. The Reed, this one here, this black building, is the newest building in that development. But this is also a good example of how these zoning laws in the city now make it very, very clear that any new building or development on the river is required to create riverwalk space, public access. Because we want to make sure that every new structure that's built, we provide space for the public to enjoy the river's edge. So that's very exciting, because the river wasn't always like that. You know, the river, you can see many of the buildings are built right up against it. But we're trying to change that with the new developments. All right, let's turn our attention back to that skyline. I want to introduce you to a trio of buildings that I call the leading ladies of the sky. Straight ahead, that massive black tower with the 2 wide antennas on top, that's the tallest building in the city of Chicago. I call her the Empress of the Sky. That is the Sears or Willis Tower. We'll talk about the name in a little bit. Now, in front of the Empress is our queen, that brownish pink granite building with the crown of barrels on the roof. I think she looks just like a queen chess piece, named after her address, 311 South Wacker Drive. And we'll talk about both these buildings in more detail in a minute, because I want to start with our goddess. Over to the right, it has that statue on the roof. Kind of looks like the Oscar statue. Now, some of you might recognize that building as Wayne Enterprises from the film Batman Begins. But it's actually the Chicago Board of Trade building, Art Deco structure from 1930. And that statue on the roof, that's not Oscar, that is Ceres, the Roman goddess of agriculture, because that is the building where the city traded agricultural stocks on the stock market. Which brings us back to our queen, right here in front of us, with the crown of barrels on the roof. Now, she was finished in 1990, and our queen does have a tale of woe. Originally, at night, those barrels on the roof were lit up with over 1,800 fluorescent lights. It was so bright that at night, migrating flocks of birds would mistake the roof of the building for the moon. And because birds use the moon to navigate at night, it actually disrupted their flight patterns. They would fly around in circles, become exhausted, crash into the building. It was a huge problem. And that is why, twice a year now in the spring and fall months, during bird migration season, every skyscraper in Chicago dims their rooftop lights, so we don't interrupt the birds' flight patterns anymore. But that does bring us finally to the tallest building in the city of Chicago, the biggest of the black boxes, the Empress of the Sky, the Sears or Willis Tower, depending on who you ask. Now, back in 1974, Sears department store built the tallest building in the world right here in Chicago. That was the Sears Tower. Now, that company, Sears, sold the building and left the city in the 90s. And then in 2009, the Willis Insurance Group signed a lease for 3 floors of office space in the Sears Tower out of 110 total floors. But in that lease was a clause that said for an extra $1 million a year, they could also lease the naming rights, just like with sports stadiums. So for $1 million a year, Willis Insurance gets to call that the Willis Tower. Now, I've lived in Chicago, like I said, 10 years now. I consider myself a local, and like the locals, I'm stubborn. I still call it the Sears Tower. Most Chicagoans do, right? We're deeply stubborn people, you know what I'm talking about. We don't like change, because we love our city so much. But folks, this is pretty much the best place in the city to take a photo of the Sears, because you can see the entire height uninterrupted, looking really, really beautiful against that clear blue sky. I always love it when you get that blue sky behind it. Now, the Sears Tower clocks in at 1,451 feet tall, or 442 meters. But how do we measure the specific height of a skyscraper, right? It's a competitive industry to have a tall building, and they're measured to the nearest foot. So where do you start measuring? Where do you stop measuring? And more importantly, who sets the rules for that measuring process? Well, that would be the creatively named Council on Tall Buildings. That's what they came up with. They determined to measure the height of a skyscraper. You start at the bottom of the lowest level floor, and you measure to the top of the structure or permanent spire. Here's the thing, folks. Even though those antennas are gigantic, they are not considered permanent nor spires. The council calls those utilities, which means they are not, quote, architecturally significant, so they do not count towards the height of the building. But I just think that makes a record even more impressive, right? Because the Sears was the tallest building on Earth by roof height alone for 24 years, until 1998, which is a really long time to hold that record. But it is no longer the tallest building in the world. That record currently goes to the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. It is 2,717 feet tall, which, yeah, makes it almost twice the height of the Sears Tower. A gigantic building. And who designed the Burj Khalifa? Well, you guys know, Chicago's very own world's tallest architect. Okay, I heard a lot of Smiths. So we got some half credit on the book. Did anyone get Adrian Smith? Did anyone remember that name? Did you in the back? Okay, great. You get a gold star. The rest of you, F minuses. Okay? I'm calling your parents. No, I'm kidding. Okay, look over here to the right. You'll see the top of the Sears Tower. If you can't see it on the right side of the boat, don't worry. You'll see it in a moment through this gap. And you'll notice 5 glass boxes sticking out of the side of the tallest tower on the Sears. That is the 103rd floor. It's called the Sky Deck. Those boxes are called the Ledge. And listen, if you want, you can get a ticket. Take an elevator up to that floor, walk out into one of those glass boxes, look through the floor, 1,353 feet down to the street below. And if that sounds like fun to you, go for it. If you are a tour guide with a debilitating fear of heights like me, it'll take you almost 10 years to get up one of those boxes. But I will have you know, I did it last fall. I faced my fear, I went up in the box, I got my picture taken. And I have a tip for those of you that want to do it, but you're afraid of heights, right? If you want the street cred for that photo, this is what you do. Don't walk in the box forward, because you're going to look through the floor and you'll lose your lunch. Do what I did. Walk in backwards, get your picture taken, and then run away. Which I literally did, and the employee laughed at me. I'm curious to know, has anyone here done the ledge? Any of you got up in the boxes? Okay, a few of you. All right. What did you think? It was nice? Yeah? Were you scared? No? Oh my gosh, you're so confident. It was nice. Okay, great.